So what kind of input did the actual FBI have on the show, the FBI?
Quite a bit. Number one, nobody could work on the FBI who had not been approved by the Bureau. As a result, John Conwell, the casting director, told me that when they started, they had wanted to approve all actors. And John said that is impossible. I mean, they settled for approving the guest stars, the guest stars that were coming on. But he said there was no way that they could that he could submit the whole cast list, because that would be happening as the show progressed and some of the smaller roles. So they agreed that we would just get the guest stars approved, and then after a show was cast, the rest of those names would be submitted, and if anybody did not pass, they would not be brought back. I was doing one episode in the second season. It was called The Courier, and it had the leading role was for an actress, which happened very seldom. I mean, mostly the men were the leads, and the women was either the wife or the gun moll. But this was a leading lady, and I had been wanting to I just wanted to work with Bette Davis. And so I suggested to John, I said, this is a great chance, why don't we submit it to Bette Davis? And John smiled and told me the story. He said the first year, her Bette Davis agents had contacted him and told him that she liked the show and that she would like to do it, for him to keep an eye out for a role that might work for her. He said a new script came in, and he took a look at it, and it wasn't the lead, but it was a good character role, and it could have been special guest star. And so without thinking, he thought, this is my chance. He sent the script with an offer over to her agent for her. After he did that, he realized he had not submitted her name for approval, so he thought it was just a formality. So he submitted it to Ed, who was the FBI agent who was assigned to the show. He had two FBI agents assigned to the show. Ed, who worked in the office, and I can't remember the other man's name, great guy, gray-haired man, who worked with us on the set, and gave the name to Ed to submit to get approval, and word came back she was not approved. And he sweated. John said he really was concerned, because what if her agents accepted? What do you do? Fortunately, for some reason, she was not available. She was not available and had to turn it down, which relieved him. And so I said to John, I said, yes, but I mean, Bette Davis is the first lady of the American screen. I mean, this show should be honored. I mean, if she would, come on to do it, and this is a leading role. Let's talk to Ed and see find out if we can get a special request and just see if, whatever this nonsense is, get past it. So we went to Ed and told him, explain this whole thing, to put it through and to just say that we really wanted her, list her credits and, the whole press agentry thing, which he did, and they still said no, would not tell us why, no reason, just she was not acceptable, and so she did not do the show.
And J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI at that time, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. I don't know whether it ever got up as far, whether he was the one who was putting the kibosh or whether it was the agency. I'm sure, whatever. But the fact that they said no.
But as far as procedures, when the show was shot, the FBI was there to make sure things were
and they were there in terms of procedures, and the fact if you had two agents and you never aimed the gun if there was an agent there. The minute an agent moved into your line of fire, the gun went up. I mean, they were there to help us with all of that. So.
Ford Motor Company was a huge sponsor of the FBI.
They sponsored every other week.
What kind of input did they have?
A lot. To begin with, they had a lot of input, but they also were a lot of help. We used a lot of cars, and we used a lot of different kinds of cars and different strata in society. I mean, and Tom, his name was Tom, I don't remember his last name, he was the representative from the agency that represented Ford. And Tom would come to our production meeting, and as we went through the production meeting where we would, talk about every possible technical thing that was going to happen, and one of the things was any scene where there was a car, what kind of car we needed, and we could be most specific, and he would deliver it. Well, a show in the first season that I did called The Plunderers, and it started with the robbery of an armored car robbery. And so at that meeting, Tom, when we said that was what we were going to need, Tom said, but Ford doesn't make an armored car. Oh. He said, well, why don't you use a panel truck? And we all said, the producer said, I said, the production manager, we all said no. And so we finally got to use an armored car that was produced by somebody else. There was another show, I think it was called Ordeal. In the second season, it was a ripoff of Wages of Fear, where it had to do with transporting a cargo of nitroglycerin. And the final act, and the last leg of the journey, and at this point, Stephen Brooks' character was now undercover, and he was driving. He was with the shipment, so that Jerry O'Loughlin was driving, and Steve was in the back of the truck, and the nitroglycerin was suspended, and then he was to hold on to it. And of course, they were driving carefully all the way through the show. But now they were in a snowstorm, not in a rainstorm, heavy rainstorm in the mountains, on the descent, and the script said the brakes were giving out, so that the car was going to be careening down. Of course, Ford said the brakes on a Ford never give out. And of course, what we would have done with that would have done to an insert showing the foot pumping on the brake. So we couldn't do that. So all we could do was we had to do the fast descent. So we just drove him, photographed him driving down the hill fast. Yes, they had input.
Was there a concern mainly that it didn't matter if a bad guy drove a Ford, just that the Ford car operate correctly? And
oh yes,
that's what it was.
And also that all the cars we used were Fords. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things when we went to say shoot in downtown L.A., and if you were just shooting wide shots, that we couldn't control all the traffic. I mean, when we were shooting isolated things, we could supply the extra cars we needed to, if we needed cars to pass somebody to go in the other direction, we could put our own Fords in. Well, if you're shooting downtown L.A., you just shoot what's there. They kept an eye open, and if anything but a Ford drove through your shot, you did it again. And no, I take that back. We couldn't do no. I'm having this wrong. If we couldn't possibly control and be sure that every car was a Ford, so just regular models we let go by. The one no, and if it drove into your shot, you had to reshoot, and that was the Volkswagen Bug. Mm. And if you were shooting and a Volkswagen Bug drove through, do that again. The other cars, they just had to accept the fact that there would be other models, and they went by fast enough, maybe they would look like a Ford.
Got it. Okay. Let me ask you about a couple specific episodes of the FBI. The Death Wind.
Oh, yes. That was my nadir. That show started with an explosion of a ship at sea, and it has sunk. Now, the Coast Guard men went down in their diving gear to check. They couldn't find anything wrong. The Navy men went down. They couldn't find anything wrong. Zimmy and Steve, the two FBI men, they're going to put on their wetsuits. They're the ones that are going to go down and find out why the ship sank. So we went down to the Navy down in Long Beach. There's a Navy station. And I spent a day down there shooting shots of Steve and Zimmy in their scuba gear, coming down, getting into the boat, panning the boat out, camera in the boat, as we're pulling away across their shoulders, going over the side. I shot enough, half an hour of film of the two of them. Adrian Samish was the other executive. He was in charge of scripts. In other words, Arthur was post-production, Adrian was pre-shooting. And Adrian, Howard Alston the production manager, came down to me the day after, around noontime. They had just looked at the dailies over at the Goldwyn studio. We were shooting at Warner Brothers. And he came down to the set and he said, I just had a call from Adrian. And Adrian said to me, Howard, I asked that you put Steve and Zimmy in identifiable scuba wear so that later, when we do the underwater shots, we'll be able to tell them apart. Why can't my wishes be carried out? And Howard said, well, I said to him, Adrian, we had Zimmy in a black scuba suit, wetsuit. Steve was in a black suit with a yellow stripe down the body and down his arm. Zimmy had on black fins. Steve had on yellow fins. Zimmy had on a black mask. Steve had a yellow mask. Steve wore a hood on his head, and Zimmy went bareheaded. I don't know what else we could have done. And Adrian, who had just sat through a half hour of watching daily, said, "Oh, I didn't notice." That tells a lot about the people that went to watch dailies, and that they really didn't always know what they were looking at.
I assume Zimmy is Efren Zimmer's
Yes.
Jr.'s nickname, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Tell me about an episode called The Assassin.
That's another story about Adrian. The Assassin was the best script the best FBI script of any of them. It was a great, great script. And it was about a hired assassin, and we had a great cast. Dean Jagger making his first appearance after Mr. Novak had gone off the air, and I think there had been an illness, so he hadn't worked for a year. And he was doing the show. For the assassin, originally I wanted David Wayne. The blonde, just that innocent face, and David Wayne was not available. Then I suggested Gig Young. Wasn't blonde, wasn't fair, but he was basically a comedian before the Shoot Horses proved that he was a fine dramatic actor. He wasn't available. John came to me and said that he suggested Fritz Weaver. I said, no, Fritz Weaver is a fine actor, but that is exactly what I don't want. I mean, I don't want to play it. I want to play it differently. Then he called and said, how about George C. Scott? Well, George was different than what I had imagined, but I had worked with him, and I mean, he was such a sensational actor. I said, yeah, I won't say no to George. Well, he wasn't available. So then John came to me and said, called me again and said, "We've just had word from the agent. There's another offer out for Fritz Weaver, and if we want him, we have to take him now." I said, "I don't want Fritz Weaver." And by this time, I had said that the actor I now wanted was somebody I had seen at UCLA in a play that John Houseman had directed, part of his theater group out there. His name was William Wyndham. And I said, "I want William Wyndham." And well, we went round and round. I finally got William Wyndham, and Johnny Conwell told me that the day after the show aired, he had phone call after phone call commending him on casting Wyndham in the role. Wyndham was just superb.
Did you encounter...
I have one more story, too.
Okay.
I just remembered.
Okay.
There was a climactic scene where the assassin, the William Wyndham character, has a young college student, a young radical, and he is setting him up to do the assassination, because he is aware now that there are traps around, and so he is aware, and but he talks the kid into it, and gives him the gun, and Charlie Larson, the producer and the one who did the rewrite that really created this great script, and Charlie called me and said he'd had another note from Adrian. Adrian said, "The boy, it's not real the way it's not real that he accepts the challenge." And Charlie knew how I felt about the script. I mean, I could be a pain in the neck when it came to wanting changes, but this was a time where I was out to protect the script. And Charlie said, "Now, don't get excited." He said, "No, Adrian is a nut about fishing, and he found a place just before the kid agrees." He said, he put in the stage direction, "hooked like a fish." That was the only change we made in the script, and it got approved. And the show is dynamite.
In your career, did you have any encounters with or dealings with McCarthyism or the blacklist?
Yes. I don't know if it was McCarthyism, but in 1964, when I was doing a show at Metro, Dr. Kildare, Maybe Love Was Saved My Apartment House, and I had worked the year before in New York with Al Lewis, who went on to play one of the characters in the Addams Family. But he was a funny man.
Grandpa Munster.
Huh?
Like Grandpa Munster.
Yes, that one.
In the Munsters.
Yeah, in the Munsters. Right. And he was a funny man and a wonderful actor. I mean, his Naked City for me, he was just superb. So I asked for him, and NBC didn't say why. They said no, and this is 1964. They just said no. That and the other brush I had on Breaking Point, Richard Collins, the associate producer, and then later the producer of the show, was one of the people who had been caught up in that whole McCarthyism thing. But he was one of the ones who had testified and had given names. And during the time that we were working on the show, I don't know why, all of a sudden, he was getting phone interview after phone interview about that period. And this was in 1963, 64, so this was a decade later. And he was being interviewed all over the place about his participation and in that. And he was a great guy. I mean, he was just as American as all my other communist friends.
What do you remember about working on directing the Wild Wild West and working with Robert Conrad and Ross Martin?
That was a fun show. And really strange bedfellows. I mean, when I was signed to do that, I mean, I thought I had been doing heavy dramas, for a couple of comedies, but I mean, this was really far out stuff. But I enjoyed it. And Mike Garrison, who had created the show, I did my first one at the end of the first year, he had created the show, and then for some reason, CBS, in their infinite unwisdom, didn't let him produce it. And they had gone through a string of producers. They had 3 or 4 different producers, and they kept changing because nobody was getting it right. And I don't know how Mike did it, but he finally got control, and he was producing the show, and he was fun to work with, and there was a kindred spirit there. I mean, I liked him, and he liked me, and he liked what I was doing. And then when the beginning of the second season, I was booked to do one early on, and by which time we had gone into color. They had gone into color, and this one was with Ida Lupino, and Mike wanted me to stay on and do a bunch more, and I was committed. From that show, I was going over to the FBI, and I was going under an exclusive to do 13 shows. I was going to do my season, and he just argued and argued to talk me out of it, and I said, but I'm committed. I mean, I have a contract to go over there. And actually, I think before the year was out, he had been upended again. So it was just as well.
Did shooting in color generally, and the gags and tricks specifically on Wild Wild West, did that slow down production at all?
No, again, these cameramen were dynamite. The cameraman on that was Teddy Voigtlander, and I had worked with Teddy earlier. He had filled in for 3 days on one of my Dr. Kildares when Harkey Smith had to take off. Teddy was just, a superb cameraman, had been an operator in feature films. He, Billy Spencer, Jerry Finnerman, all of them, they were just great photographers. And the thing when it came to color, they lit color like they did black and white, cross light, as compared to the guys coming in later who figured, well, it's color, just throw light in here. The color separates it. You don't have to do the cross light, but the cross lighting and the shaping. Teddy was superb.
You directed a couple of episodes of Ironsides. What kind of challenges was it for you what kind of challenges did you have directing Raymond Burr in a wheelchair?
Oh, that was no problem. The wheelchair was no problem. And Raymond Burr used teleprompters exclusively. Now, I'm sure he had studied, he knew the lines, but I mean, he was always, he was always the total pro in knowing it. But he did teleprompters, and he did it the most effective way that I'd ever seen. If in doing a close-up, as you're doing of me now, and if the person playing with him was to be standing camera right, as you are, the camera wasn't, the person didn't stand there. That's where they put the teleprompter. And the actor playing it would stand behind it. And then if someplace, and he would work this out, if someplace he decided that he wanted to do this, he would put a teleprompter down there. And if another time he was going to do this, he would put a teleprompter up there. And that was all worked out, and it worked like magic. The wheelchair was no problem. But the big thing on that show was I came in, did my 6 days. 6 days of prep, was all set, went home, and after I got home, was all set to come in and shoot the next day, start filming the next day, and I got a call from Cy Shermack, the producer. And Cy said, now, come in tomorrow morning, ready to shoot, but you won't. Universal had a system. Most shows had a crew. There was a camera crew, a sound crew. I mean, every one of the crews, everyone on the crew was assigned to that show, and that was the unit. Universal had a theory that they didn't want their people, their people's allegiance to be to the show. They wanted their allegiance to be to the studio. And so each show, like when a new show came up, whatever camera crew had just finished, they were the ones that were assigned. Whatever sound crew had just finished a show and was at the top of the list, they were assigned. Wardrobe, hair, makeup, lighting, down the list. Well, Raymond Burr, who for years had done Perry Mason, didn't like it, and he had been complaining about it, and kept saying he wanted to have his crew. He didn't want this thing of coming in and each week it was like a whole different ununified unit. And they kept saying, "Oh yeah, Ray, we'll do it," but they never did it. And so Cy said, "You come in tomorrow ready to shoot, but you're not going to shoot because Ray is not going to show up. He is not showing up," and he has notified them that he is not going to show up to shoot, and they have already scheduled a meeting in the Black Tower with Ray. And so that was what had happened. We went in, didn't shoot. Ray went upstairs, and they said, "Ray, baby, anything you want." And so he came back and we finished the show. And as a matter of fact, that was one of the happier experiences I had at Universal. Universal was never a happy place for me to work. There was just something about it. I used to say, I think they have electronic eyes at the gate. And as you drive through that electronic eye, all creativity is drained out of you. One other story. When I did, a few years before that, when I'd done my first arrest and trial, the cameraman was Lionel Linden, Curly Linden, had won his Oscar for Around the World in 80 Days, and Curly was a character, and I came in my usual way, ready, prepared. I would lay out a shot and say, we want to start here with this shot, and the camera will move here, and lay it all out very carefully. And Curly would just look at me, reach in his back pocket, take out a rag, slam it to the ground, and say, "Put the damn camera there." And he did that for 6 relentless days, 6 of the 9 days. And I mean, he really kind of had me spooked. Never said anything. It was just this attitude. And midway through the 6th day, we were on location out in Universal City at some park. And halfway through the day, Curly came to me and said, "I'm leaving the show." And he wished me well and wished me good luck. I mean, just the nicest he could be. And I found out that he had had an altercation with somebody in the transportation department who was Jewish, and he had made an anti-Semitic remark. And the head of the department had gone back to the studio and complained. So Curly was removed from the show, and Walter Strange came in and replaced him. Well, I had vowed from then on that when I went back to Universal, you never knew who you were going to be assigned as your cameraman, and I just kept thinking, well, if they assign him, I'm just gonna ask to please not do it because I don't think I can face it. Well, by the time we got to, I think it was around 66, it must have been 66, 67, some. By the time we got to there, and I came back to do the Ironside, and Curly was assigned to it, and I thought, well, I've been around the ballpark a couple times. I can handle him now. He was a dream. He was just a dream. People came on the set and couldn't believe. Curly was laughing. I mean, the set was it was a wonderful, wonderful, charming set. And there was and he was fast. I'll tell you, good, great lighting, but fast. And one day, I got wind about 3:30 in the afternoon. We were going along so well, I could see the assistant directors talking to the production office, and they're already making plans for us to move to another stage. And I went to him and I said, "Curly, do you want to, when we finish here, do you want to move to another stage, another sound stage?" He said, "Shit, no." I said, "Well, you'd better slow down because that's what they're making plans to do." So he did. He slowed down. And all of a sudden, we were still doing fine, but we just was a little slower than what. We finished maybe about 5:15, 5:20, early enough to give us an early evening and an early day off, but too late to make the move. No, he was great, and the show turned out. Something because of that feeling on the set, the show turned out about as good as the shows on Universal did.
Was Mission Impossible a difficult show to direct?
Yes.
You answered before I even finished the question.
The minute you said Mission Impossible, I said, yes, I knew. Yeah, it was.
Why?
Well, again, it was on the 6-day schedule, and the amount of work, the amount of work laid out was just horrendous. We had a day, I was doing a show called The Train, which incidentally, at the end of the year when they had to submit their entry, they were nominated for an Emmy, and when you're nominated, then they picked the entry to submit for the committee, and The Train was the one that was submitted, and they won. But we had this day on location with moving trains, and I went out there with Barry Crane, who was the production manager, and they gave me 2 cameras, and I worked out with Barry. There was no way that I was going to get the day's work done. I worked out with Barry. There were certain shots that could be done with the second camera with an Aeroflex that didn't require sound, so we wouldn't have to have the sound crew. And they were action shots, or I think Peter Lupus had shots of him climbing up a place to get up to a place up there, and then shots of him looking. And so I just laid out those shots for Barry, and then Barry, when I wasn't using the 2 cameras, would take the second camera and do it. And we ended up, I think we came in, I had 69 setups that day on location. And when we looked at the show later, I went to the answer print screening, and one of the agency men that was there was somebody that I'd known back in my CBS days. And he asked how many days were you on location for the train stuff, and I said 1. Nobody would believe it. And at the end, when we finished the show, and the next year, at the beginning of the season, and Joe Gatman was producer and an old friend again from CBS, and they wanted to book me for 6 shows that season, and I said absolutely not, and so just said no, wouldn't go back. It was a killer, an absolute killer.
Did you work at all directly with the creator, Bruce Geller?
I knew Bruce, but there was not too much interplay. No, I mean, as the executive, he didn't. He wasn't that involved.
Well, what did you think? What did you think of the cast, especially
they were wonderful.
Stephen Hill and Martin Landau?
Well, Stephen Hill. See, at this point, Martin at that point was just the guest star, and Stephen Hill was still the star, but it was near the end of the season, and Stephen, was an Orthodox Jew, and Stephen was having problems with, like on Friday, which is a day that they would want to do their night work, and it was the Sabbath, and Stephen didn't want to, and so they were making plans to dump him, I guess, because on this show, they just used Stephen for the intro, the intro. Mm-hmm. So he did the intro, he did the getting of the message, and then he did the one scene where he met with the group and assigned them. And then what would have been his role, Martin Landau. Mm. They just moved Martin Landau, and he played it. He didn't use Stephen's name. I mean, and then they brought in for what would have been the role that he was playing. We brought in Bill Shallard. Mm. And so I only worked with Stephen just long enough to do, the listening of the message and then the meeting with the group. But he was fine, wonderful actor.
Let's talk about Star Trek.
Do we have to?
Sure.
I've been talking about it for 70 years.
Before you directed Star Trek, did you like it? Were you aware of it at the time?
No, and I was not a sci-fi fan. I just got a call from my agent one day and said, there's a chance for you to do a Star Trek. And I said, okay.
So did you meet with Gene Roddenberry or the producer at the time, Gene Coon?
Well, I met with Gene Coon, and of course, I don't know who booked me. It could have been Gene, because I'd already done the 2 Wild Wild West with him. So it could have been Gene. I don't know who threw my name in the hopper. But it was Gene that I worked with.
So let me ask you about some of the specific episodes that you did direct.
Okay.
Okay. This Side of Paradise.
Yes.
Okay. there, one of the famous parts of that episode is that Spock shows emotion.
Yes.
Okay, so you were the director who directed him.
Well,
anything?
directors, that's a fallacy when you think that directors tell actors how to play a scene. You stage the scene, you stage the blocking, and if what they're doing emotionally is off, you acknowledge it. But I mean, Leonard Nimoy wasn't off, and one of the memorable moments in that, there was a scene where Spock has been off with Layla, and Kirk has been trying to reach him, and finally catches up with him. And I originally, as it was written in the script, and the way I staged it, I had there were 5 of them: Kirk, Sulu, one other man, and Leonard and Jill Ireland, who's playing Layla. And they were standing in the center of the field talking, and Kirk is saying, why wouldn't you talk to me? Why were you disrespectful when I tried to reach on the phone? And Spock was being a little sassy, and it just wasn't working. And I looked across the field, and there was this wonderful branch. And I said to Jerry Finnerman, and I'd never done it before, and I've never done it since. I said, I want to break the setup and move it and go someplace else. He said, fine. So we went over there, and that was where I had Spock hang like a monkey from the limb, and he just changed. I mean, he used that, and it just became a wonderful scene. And then Bill Shatner, his response to him hanging from the limb, and the disrespect he was showing, he played it. It's a classic scene.
The episode Metamorphosis.
Oh, my favorite.
Why?
Technically, Jerry Finnerman. He is most responsible. The sound stage that we did that on, we had 2 sound stages, one for the Enterprise and one for the swing sets. And they were small. They were the 3 sound stages like at the end of the lot, and the 3rd sound stage was Mission Impossible. And this was the one in the middle. And they were small sound stages, and here's this, we're supposed to do this big planet. And Jerry Finnerman said, number one, he decided to do a purple psych. And the psych was not even a full 180 degrees. To do a purple psych, and then he decided that we would use not even an 18 millimeter, we were going to use the fisheye, the 9 millimeter, which I had never used, didn't know about before. Well, the fisheye, I mean, it was great, except it was seeing off of the top of the cyclorama, it was seeing the top of the soundstage. So Jerry brought in rocks and sort of framed them around, and he just did that throughout, so that when you looked at the spaceship, it looked like it was a football field away. And then when Glenn Corbett came and stood in the foreground, and we just saw his legs, it looked like it was forever. We had the problem when he ran to them, we had to cut away to other shots, a series of shots, because otherwise he got there in 5 paces rather than a football field. But I mean, it was just, it's a great, great illusion. And Paramount has, in their last remastering, some of the shots, they didn't do anything regarding the shots of the shuttlecraft with the rocks around it, because I don't think they could have. But there were shots of, again, we had a shot of the Glenn Corbett character. And again, we had to frame him with the rocks. Well, they took the rocks away and digitally filled in the sky so that there he is in the middle of this very, very empty planet. And it's great. It's just great.
That episode stood out for you then. You said that episode stood out for you, right?
Yeah. Well, and the script. The script was great. Again, an original by Gene Kuhn. Mm-hmm. He rewrote practically everything, but this was one that he wrote from scratch, and it was just a great script.
Tell me about Obsession, the episode called Obsession.
Yes, that was with Steve Brooks. That was Moby Dick. That's Moby Dick. That by that time, no, we had soundstage work again too. I mean Planet work again. It was my guest star on that was Stephen Brooks, whom at that point I'd done 2 Nurses, 11 FBIs. So this was the 14th show that we had done together, and that was nice because he was really a very, very fine young actor who Hollywood kind of gobbled up and destroyed. Shooting of the show was no great problem. The stuff on the Planet worked. The script was tight. The main thing I remember about it is that at the very end, Herb Solow, the head of production, and John Meredith Lucas, who was the incoming new producer because Gene Kuhn was leaving, and they came to me on the set, I don't know, it was a couple of days from finishing, and wanted to know if I would be available to stay on to direct the next, to stay on and start another show immediately. I don't know why they had a vacancy all of a sudden. And I said, no, I can't because it's the Jewish high holidays and I don't work on them. And Herb Solow was not to be deterred. He said, let me get a calendar. So he got the calendar out and he looked and he said, now Rosh Hashanah, that's going to fall, and he picked out the dates, that's during the prep period. He said, you just have your preparation done so that you don't have to come to the studio those days. That'll work. Yom Kippur was going to fall on a Saturday, but Yom Kippur Eve would be on Friday. He said, no problem. John, who was a member of the Directors Guild, John will come in 3 or 4 o'clock whenever you need to leave. You'll leave, and John will take over and finish that day's work. And that's what we did. And then John always called himself my Yom Kippur director.
Was that on an episode called Return to Tomorrow,
And then that was Return to Tomorrow,
right?
Which is not a favorite. That's the poorest of the shows that I did. In fact, on my website, that's the one I don't talk about.
I think you said the less said the better on your blog.
It just didn't work. And now I'm finding out, I'm reading that there really were great problems between the original writer and Gene Roddenberry's rewriting of it, and that the original writer took his name off of it because it just was one of those things that maybe as an idea, or if you wrote about it and read it, it would work, but it just didn't work. It was the one with these 3 people from this other planet who were deposited in what I called the big ping pong balls. And it just was, I always thought it was silly.
Anything you care to reminisce about the episode Bread and Circuses?
That was the first show that I did after Paramount bought Desilu. And up until then, we had a 6-day schedule. Gene Kuhn had told me when I came aboard, he said, it's a 6-day schedule, but there are some shows that go 7 days, so we're averaging out at 6.5 days. Paramount bought Desilu, and of course Paramount at that time was owned by Gulf Western, and Doug Kramer was put in charge of production. And the edict out now is that the shows will be done in 6 days. Not only will they be done in 6 days, the normal shooting day was 7 o'clock crew call in the morning for an 8 o'clock shoot and shoot till 7 o'clock at night. We are now going to quit at 6:12. That was 48 minutes a day that was being cut off, and I figured that in terms of the 6 days, that 48 minutes really amounted to just minutes short of a half a day, so that they were now expecting Star Trek to be shot in 5.5 days. And it, it was just impossible. And on Bread and Circuses, I mean, a lot of it works. I was never happy with the gladiator stuff because the gladiator scenes needed time just for the safety of the actors, and there wasn't the time. And as a result, I just think that the scenes they're okay, but they're just okay, and it's certainly not up to the standard of the kind of work that was done on Paradise and on Metamorphosis.
In the episode, Is There No Truth? Is there in truth no beauty? Was there a conflict involving a prop piece of jewelry?
Oh, there were several conflicts on that show. The biggest conflict came on the very first day, and it really had to do with that prop. It wasn't a prop; it was a piece of jewelry, and the Eidik that Spock was to wear, and our original the first scene we were to shoot was that dinner scene with Diana Muldaur, Leonard, Bill, Scotty DeForest, and David Frankham. And Bill and Leonard had decided that they didn't want to do the scene because they felt that it was commercial, that Gene was using that as a means of merchandising the pin which he had designed. And I didn't know this until recently, that Leonard called Fred Freiberger, the new producer. I mean, they were changing him faster than you could change your underwear. Maybe they'd done better if they'd changed their underwear. But he had called Fred Freiberger, and Fred wouldn't do anything about it. So Leonard called Gene Roddenberry, and Gene came to the set, and we spent the whole morning in a round table, except the only ones talking were Bill and Leonard and Gene. And the rest of us just sat there until arguing back and forth, and Gene denying that he was being commercial, and the boys insisting that they didn't want any part of it because it was merchandising. And so Gene finally agreed that he would rewrite, and he did rewrite, and the Eidik is still in the script, but much, much less emphasized than it had been. And in the meantime, I lost a half a day, and that show went 7 days. And I know, don't go into the next one. Tell people to go to my website and read about it. The Tholian web was very painful.
You can't talk about that?
Huh?
Anything you can talk about that?
Oh, I can. I wrote about it in detail.
Right. Well, what's the short version?
The short version was that I showed up on Monday morning to shoot. The first sequence was to be four men, Kirk, Spock, Doc, and Chekhov, who were in silver lame suits on another spaceship, which was going to be the Enterprise doubling, where all of the crew were dead. And it was an extended sequence, and why were they dead, and what happened. And I got to the studio. There were no spacesuits. The boys had been called to the studio the day before Sunday for their first fittings. Now they were putting them together and having final fittings and sewing them together, and there was nothing to shoot. Finally, we got one of the spacesuits ready, so we put it on Bill, and I shot wherever I could find a close-up of Bill, even though we hadn't shot the scene, an isolated close-up. So I caught, maybe I shot 2 or 3 close-ups until the other spacesuits, one by one, were ready, so that we had all 4 men in their spacesuits to keep working. Little problem. The spacesuits were skin tight. There was no way you could use zippers. They would have shown. Mm-hmm. There was no way you could have used snaps. They would have shown. They were sewed into the spacesuits. Now, from 1 o'clock to 6:12, people do have to go to the restroom. when any of the four had to go to the restroom, they had to be unsewn, go to the restroom, come back, be resewn. Well, of course, the net result was at the end of the day, I was a half a day behind. The next 2 days, there was a lot of the heavy production shots that we're doing. The end of the third day, I was still a half a day behind, and I was fired. And not only was I fired, then the next morning in the trade papers, in both trade papers, there was an article about my being fired and about shows going over schedule, and with Doug Kramer taking responsibility for seeing that shows were going to come in on schedule. And I didn't work for months. It was like I had been put on the blacklist, and it wasn't until the end of the year, when we get to courtship of Eddie's father, I'll be able to tell you how I went back to work.
So you were scapegoated.
I was the scapegoat, yeah. And a lot of it fell into place when I read the fine book that Herb Solow and Bobby Justman wrote on Star Trek, when they detail that there was a real battle going on between Doug Kramer's office and both Star Trek and Mission Impossible. And he was just out, he was out to make a point, and I was the point. And the other thing that really, I think, probably contributed, that was the first show that Jerry Finnerman left the show and was replaced by Al Francis, who, number one, was not as fast as Jerry, wasn't really the cameraman that Jerry was, and didn't have the emotional connection to me that, although he had been Jerry's operator, but Jerry was very protective of me when we worked. And I have a feeling that had he been there, that maybe it would have turned out differently.
Let me get a quick impression from you about some of the cast members, for Star Trek. Let's start with William Shatner.
Bill was fine, but different kind of actor, different kind of actor than Leonard, different kind of actor than DeForest. Bill was glib. Bill just did it, and but he did it, and he did it fine. And there were occasions. He always did it, and it was always fine. And then there are special occasions. There's a great, fine scene that he does in Metamorphosis when he is talking with that translator to the cloud, and he did a remarkably good job on that scene. And at Daly's, when we saw it the next day, Gene Kuhn, after Bill's take, said, "That's why we pay him the big money."
Leonard Nimoy.
Oh, it's just great. Just great. Fine actor, always ready, and really, he was so constricted by the role. But within that, the jail scene, the cell scene between Spock and McCoy in Bread and Circuses, where even within that restriction, he just does so much, and yet when he is given the opportunity, as he was in This Side of Paradise, and as he was in Is There in Truth No Beauty, where he became another character, and he just did it. He just did it, and always came to the set. He doesn't have to worry about Leonard. Just whatever asked him to do, he would just do it, and just flesh it out. It was wonderful. He wrote me, after we did This Side of Paradise, wrote me a beautiful, beautiful note.
DeForest Kelley.
Same, just the same, just dynamite. A total Southern gentleman.
James Doohan.
Very good, wonderful actor. Again, limited because he had so little to do. But he did it. In fact, that applied to him, to Chekhov, to Sulu, to Uhura. Each one of them came, and they really had thankless roles. The only thanks was that they got a paycheck, but they just came and never any fuss about why isn't my part bigger or any resentment. I mean, they just came and fleshed out words with people which they filled. I mean, it was a crew.
The same for George Takei?
I said
Yeah,
Sulu.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I used George later on a Courtship of Eddie's Father, where he had a little more to do, and charming actor.
Okay. Much has been written by some of these cast members about the conflicts with William Shatner from some of the supporting characters. Did you witness this when you were on set?
Oh, you're trying to get me to tell a story that that I've never told.
It's up to you.
I'd better not tell it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But as a director, it sounds like you didn't have...
No. It was the story that I'm not telling was just a revealing moment regarding one of them, but nothing that came out, and none of it showed. And as a matter of fact, when it happened, I was surprised.
Okay. Why do you think that Star Trek endures and has endured for so many decades, and if anything is stronger today?
I guess mostly because although it was science fiction, they were really dealing with human problems and dealing with them in a very fine way. The first year and a third, while Gene Coon was there, and Gene Coon is not given as much credit as he deserves, because he literally rewrote everything. He told me on The Wild Wild West that show was so special that writers just didn't get it. And so that what he did was they would come in with their story ideas, and if it was a story idea that was feasible to do, he would buy the idea and then send them home to write the script. And he would take that script, and he said that to him was the first draft, and then he just did the rewrite, which was faster. He would just do the rewrite, and he was literally doing the same thing on Star Trek.
In looking at your body of work, where do you kind of rank Star Trek for you?
Well, I rank other shows higher. My really top of the list would be Naked City, Route 66, the Waltons.